Back to our leading story, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has slammed the ICJ ruling in favour of South Africa as outrageous and discriminatory against the Jewish state. He says that Israel will continue to defend itself against Hamas.
Israel's commitment to international law is unwavering. Equally unwavering is our sacred commitment to continue to defend our country and defend our people. Like every country, Israel has an inherent right to defend itself. The vile attempt to deny Israel this fundamental right is blatant discrimination against the Jewish state, and it was justly rejected. The charge of genocide leveled against Israel is not only false, it's outrageous, and decent people everywhere should reject it. On the eve of the International Holocaust Remembrance Day, I again pledge as Israel's Prime Minister, never again. Israel will continue to defend itself against Hamas, a genocidal terror organization.
Joining us for reaction is Rowan, national chairperson of the South African Zionist Federation. Rowan, appreciate your time. Thanks so much for speaking to us this evening. Now, how do you interpret the International Court of Justice's order and its potential implications for Israel?
Well, good evening to you and your viewers. The International Court of Justice has implicitly reaffirmed Israel's right to self-defense, to defend itself from the genocidal entity of Hamas. And in fact, it has rejected the ANC government's call for Israel to immediately and unilaterally end its military campaign against Hamas. The court did ask Israel to continue to do what it is already doing, to uphold its obligations in terms of the Genocide Convention, and also to continue to provide humanitarian aid to the Palestinian civilians, which it already is doing. So Israel will study this judgment and continue this campaign against Hamas, and only Hamas, whilst it does everything in its power to avoid civilian casualties.
Now, you're pretty clear, Rowan, about Israel carrying on and doing what it's doing and targeting Hamas specifically. From what we have on record, close on 26,000 individuals have died since October 7th, when Hamas came into Israel and killed over 1,200 people. What is the number of members of Hamas, according to what you know, that have been killed amongst these 26,000 deaths?
So Israel says that about 10,000 combatants out of this 26,000 number were Hamas operatives, and this has been corroborated by the US and other entities. In fact, even though this is tragic, and I can tell you that any innocent civilian loss, the loss of Palestinian civilians, is absolutely tragic. But I can also tell you that Hamas is to blame. This could literally end right now as we speak if Hamas released the over 100 hostages that it still holds in captivity and renounced its intention to commit genocide against Israel and the Jewish people, and set a course for the Palestinians to live in peace side by side with Israel.
Maybe what I should also ask is, what is the relationship between Hamas and the general populace of Palestine?
Well, Hamas, Hugo, as you know, is a totalitarian entity. It's a dictatorship. So there's very limited rights or human rights inside the Gaza Strip. There's no rights of LGBT people. There's very limited rights of women and minorities. It's a very sad situation for the average Palestinian who has to live under Hamas rule and unfortunately has borne the consequences of Hamas's genocidal actions. And that is, I suppose, one of the biggest tragedies here. South Africa, instead of calling on Hamas to drop its weapons, to cease its hostilities, in fact targets Israel, the country acting in self-defense. So that is, I would say, one of the big tragedies of this current conflict.
Now, how unfortunate is it? You raise the issue that the people of Palestine are living under the dictatorial rule, if you will, of Hamas. So they essentially, in fact, literally caught in the crossfire. So they're not to blame for what's transpired, and 15,000 of them have lost their lives because Israel is intent on killing or destroying Hamas.
So that is the big tragedy, that Hamas uses its own population as human shields. It cynically hides behind its population. It uses hospitals and schools and kindergartens as military infrastructure. It fires rockets from civilian areas. And the people of Gaza, as you say correctly, bear the brunt of this. These people do not deserve this, and yet, they are living under this terrible rule. It's very difficult for them to rise up. There's no freedom of speech. And I would say that is what the international community ought to be doing, finding ways to provide more rights to people living under Hamas rule, and to find an entity that can govern the Palestinians that wants to live in peace with the Jewish state. And we have actually seen that in other places in the Middle East. Jordan lives in peace with Israel, Egypt, and over the past few years, the Abraham Accords, in which the United Arab Emirates, Morocco, Sudan, and Bahrain now live in peace with Israel. So there's big opportunities for peace. But you need these genocidal terrorist entities like Hamas to cease and to stop their operations, which is highly destructive to peace in the region.
Now, how do you think Israel can address humanitarian concerns raised by organizations like Oxfam, WHO, and the United Nations regarding the situation in Gaza?
So Israel has, in fact, been doing significant efforts to provide humanitarian aid to the people of Gaza. It does this through the Rafah crossing with Egypt. Since the 21st of October, so just a few weeks after the 7th of October atrocities, Israel has been providing over 76,000 tons of humanitarian aid, which includes food, water, and medical supplies to the Palestinian people, and has brought in over 8,000 trucks. And this happens on a daily basis, every single day, and that should go directly to the Palestinian people. Sometimes Hamas tries to intercept this, unfortunately, but Israel certainly does everything it can and works with international partners to facilitate this aid, and this obviously will continue. And this is also one of the rulings that the ICJ made, calling on Israel to continue doing this.
So let's talk about the presence of the Israeli Defense Force in Gaza at the moment. Just how big is their presence, and how much are they able to curtail further harm by being present in Gaza?
Well, there is quite a significant presence at the moment. There's several 100,000 soldiers, and there's also thousands of reservists who are waiting. And what Israel is seeking to do is to contain and limit and ultimately destroy this genocidal threat. Under international law, Israel has an obligation and right, in fact, to do this, to minimize this threat. And I think it's also important to mention that after the 7th of October, Hamas did not simply renounce its genocidal intentions. In fact, it said it will repeat these actions again and again. And this is why it is important for Israel to protect its own civilians and its own sovereignty, as it must do like any other country facing such threats under international law.
I find it peculiar that you continue to talk about the genocidal threat of Hamas. Hamas has killed a little over 1,200 civilians in Israel versus 25,000 that Israel has killed or casualties in Gaza. Surely it almost doesn't quite add up that this organization, Hamas, is threatening Israel. They have killed 1,200 Israelis or a little more. I'm not sure of that exact number. And Israel, in turn, has killed 25,000, but still feel threatened.
Well,
is there evidence? I suppose the question I'm trying to ask, Rowan, is where's the evidence of the threat outside of what they might be saying?
Well, the evidence of the threat is decades and decades of suicide bombings, of attempts by Hamas operatives to target and kill Jews in Israel and around the world, of numerous statements going back to 1988 with Hamas's founding charter, when it says it intends to destroy Israel and Jews around the world. It is very, very clear. One can take Hamas at its word. It is very, very clear what its intention is. And it has shown its ability to carry out this threat. And if Hamas had more opportunity to carry it out, it would do so in a flash.
So,
so this is not a game. You cannot say that, oh, there's one number here, one number there. It's not about that. Unfortunately, Hamas aims to maximize the death of civilians, and Israel does everything in its power to minimize the harming of its own civilians as well as Palestinian civilians. So there's absolutely no comparison or moral equivalence between these two objectives and the Israel and Hamas.
Well, there really is very little comparison between 25,000 deaths and 1,200. And are you suggesting, because you've said for decades Hamas has made threats, has carried out bombings across the globe, are the Palestinians paying right now for the crimes of Hamas from decades ago, based on your statement?
So first of all, Hugo, like I said, you can't start from the 7th of October and say Hamas, which deliberately targeted innocent Jews and civilians living in Israel and murdered, raped, beheaded people, took babies as hostages. One cannot compare that with Israel, which is doing everything it can to minimize the threat. There's absolutely no comparison between the two. And like I said, if Hamas renounced its genocidal threat immediately, it dropped its weapons and it released the hostages, this would be over immediately. That is the sad situation that we face right now.
So in your view, what could be a constructive path forward to resolve the Israel-Palestine conflict?
Well, the only solution, Hugo, is peace. And peace requires two parties to tango. You cannot make peace with yourself. As I said earlier, Israel has made peace with numerous countries in the Middle East and North Africa. Israel actually has very good relations with many countries in Africa and the Middle East. And the only long-term solution is peace with the Palestinians. And in order to have such a peace, the Palestinians need leadership that seeks peace, that seeks peace with its neighbors and renounces its intentions to destroy Israel. You cannot have a partner for peace when this partner pays people who commit terrorist atrocities or facilitates smuggling of weapons or in fact carries out these things. So I think we can agree that peace is the solution, but Israel needs a partner for peace.
Now, in our breaking news story, Israel's national carrier El Al plans to stop flights between Tel Aviv and Johannesburg from the 1st of April, from what we understand. What's your take on this reaction?
So, Hugo, this is in fact something that has been in discussions for quite a few years now. The routes between Tel Aviv and Johannesburg commercially has been quite challenging. El Al actually had 3 flights a week, and then it reduced it to 1 flight a week. And unfortunately, it's not viable commercially in order to do that. So this seems to be purely a commercial decision, but the South African government's behavior and making Israelis, who are the biggest tourists to South Africa from the Middle East, making them feel unwelcome in South Africa, certainly did not help the situation. There are, of course, other means and ways to get to Israel, and tens of thousands of Christians travel to Israel every single year on pilgrimage, and there are other options, and the Jewish community and the Zionist Federation are still in discussions with El Al to see if this route can continue, but at the moment, as you said, this route looks like it will be ending at the end of March this year.
Rowan, you did say earlier that it takes 2 to tango, and obviously in this instance it's Israel and Hamas and the Palestinians that are being caught in the crossfire. What could Israel have done better? I mean, when you look at the number of deaths that we've witnessed, the wanton destruction, the lives that have been lost and the casualties caused, is there anything that Israel could have done better?
Israel does comply with international law. It warns civilians when it is going to target a Hamas operation. It taps on buildings. It makes tens of thousands of phone calls. It lets civilians know in advance when it is going to carry out an operation. So in fact it complies with beyond the requirements of international law, and it does everything it possibly can to minimize civilian casualties. That said, of course, these are humans operating in a war situation in a very difficult climate, and of course Israel makes mistakes, like any country, like any army, and certainly anything that any mistakes that were made will be investigated and looked at. And obviously, in terms of Israel's security, Israel will be analyzing how October the 7th happened, looking into the intelligence issues that led to that, and bolstering those efforts to ensure that this kind of thing never happens again.
What are some of the potential mistakes that Israel could have made in this whole debacle?
In terms of the mistakes, well, like I said, there always are mistakes. There's been friendly fire. There has certainly been situations when Israel has made mistakes. You have people going into a very difficult territory and facing challenges, and this is, always happens. Many people have been killed on Israel's side for the same reason. And any mistake that is made is investigated and challenged and hopefully improved upon. But just to emphasize again that Israel does everything it can to comply with international law, to minimize civilian casualties, to provide humanitarian aid to the Palestinians, and also to do everything it can to secure the release of the hostages. Over 100 hostages still remain illegally in captivity by Hamas, and Israel is doing everything in its power to try and secure the release of these poor men, women, and children.
My final question, Rowan, is one of a humanitarian nature, and it speaks to mending relations and how Israel and Palestine can move forward. How do you expect that process to occur, the acceptance by the Palestinians, the innocent individuals, the fathers who've lost their sons, lost their families? We've read countless stories of individuals whose entire families have been blown to shreds, excuse the language, but who are innocent and have absolutely nothing to do with Hamas.
Like I said, every civilian death is an absolute tragedy. It is an absolute tragedy that people are killed, and is extremely sad for these people involved. And like you say, it will take a very long time for this to heal. And also what needs to happen is that the Palestinians, and many of them do not support Hamas, they realize the situation that Hamas has got them into, and they do want a new leadership that takes them towards the future. I think that is also very important. Hamas, instead of spending money on education and hospitals, it spends money on rockets and terror tunnels. That is not to benefit the average Palestinian. Humanitarian aid, instead of going to Palestinian humanitarian issues, goes to Hamas for weapons and infrastructure. That is not a solution. Again, the average Palestinian needs to, hopefully, please God, find future leadership that looks after its own people and finds peace with Israel and peace in the Middle East.
Rowan Polovin, National Chairman of South African Zionist Federation, speaking to us. Thank you for your time unpacking for us that ICJ ruling today.